Well, good day all, and welcome. Today we will fully explore the question, compare and contrast what Schopenhauer and Shantideva say about compassion, and why might their views not always be the same. Now, I'll leave it to you to draw the actual conclusions as you would in an essay. Note that as you progress to the issues of crossing boundaries, they can never be seen in isolation. The question implicitly refers to tradition, and the Buddha's reputation is fundamental. Therefore, your argument, whilst not drifting from the question, should be mindful of those topics. What are we trying to achieve? Well, firstly, let us begin with what we are not trying to do here. What we're not doing is searching for the truth about faith, trying to find out if Buddhism has the answer, or trying to find out if Buddhism is true. This is not a theocratic discourse. What we are doing is introducing ourselves to Buddhism, exploring the worldview suggested by Buddhism, and exploring what people say and do with reference to their beliefs. That is, we're interested in the ideas people use to shape their lives. An interest also shared by philosophy. We wish to form the ability to draw together perspectives from religious studies and philosophy to address a question about two accounts of compassion, and to assist in developing a clear, coherent, and well-supported argument which addresses the question. So, Buddhism, basic concepts. To understand Schopenhauer and Shantideva's views on compassion, it is necessary to explore the Four Noble Truths that form the foundations upon which all Buddhist teaching is built. Within the Buddhist tradition, there are varying strands of thinking, but all strands begin from the Four Noble Truths. So, the first Noble Truth is the notion that suffering is the cornerstone of all human life. The nature of human living involves suffering. The second Noble Truth explores the source of all suffering, stating that the origin of suffering for humans results from our basic instincts and desires, a craving caused by ignorance. The third Noble Truth is more positive, in that it is possible to end suffering with enlightenment. We can end all this if we can stop craving and responding differently. The Buddha asserts that the cessation of suffering is possible. Nirvana is an ideal state of complete wisdom and compassion for all beings. The fourth Noble Truth is an explanation of how this enlightenment can be achieved, known as the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha's prescription for achieving happiness, virtue, and eventually nirvana. Reaching nirvana involves developing insights and practicing specific qualities. I'm going now to show this clip, and please note the speaker's useful division of the Four Noble Truths into diagnosis, that is, Noble Truths 1 and 2, prognosis, that's Noble Truth 3, and prescription as Noble Truth 4.
This is the Buddha. The Buddha lived in present-day Nepal, and we still remember the Buddha because he gave us his most important teachings, the Four Noble Truths. Now, if you didn't notice, the Buddha is often referred to as a great physician, a great doctor. And why is that? Well, mainly because he was one of the most brilliant people who really understood how to listen deeply to the human heart, and from there to really understand the human heart. And our hearts are often struck with arrows and pain in a world where, no matter what we try, things hurt. And our hearts bleed. So, as a great physician, he gave us a way to heal up and to make it so that we could pull out those arrows and possibly just feel better about life and how to live. So let's start first. Any good doctor gives a diagnosis, and his diagnosis is the reality of dissatisfaction. That's the first noble truth. You have to realize and acknowledge that dissatisfaction exists. The second part is what causes this dissatisfaction. And he realized that desires for impermanence are painful. They hurt. So that's his diagnosis. Now, the next thing he would do is give a prognosis. Is that, well, if we have desires, and those are the cause of the pain, they'll eventually end. So, if we stop our desires, or let them wear themselves out, that would stop our pain. And so, again, like any good doctor, after the prognosis, he gives a prescription, the actual medicine, which is noble truth number 4, the path to lead out of dissatisfaction. And his specific form of medicine, his formula for human happiness, is known as the Eightfold Path. And it's often represented here as a wheel, because when you think about it, a wheel rolls along through life when every single one of the spokes is equally taut and working well together. And so, if you have your right thoughts, right speech, right bodily actions, and right kind of job where you're not harming or hurting anybody else, that clears your mind and actually allows you to focus your energies so you can make a right effort. And that allows you then to concentrate. And when you can concentrate, now you have ease and right mindfulness, which eventually leads to right understanding and wisdom. So, there in a nutshell is the 4 noble truths. And when we really focus on those, it helps our human heart. And according to the Buddha, when we have a heart that is free of anger, greed, and delusion, love spreads everywhere.
Okay, that was a very clear exposition of the Buddha's teaching, and it is now supported by a fuller outline of the actual prescription, that is, the Noble Eightfold Path to Enlightenment. As with the previous speaker, the points have been categorized to facilitate a deeper understanding. The first 2 are right view and right intention. Ethical conduct is divided into right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Then there is concentration to navigate the path, that is, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So, let's view the clip.
We crave things. We have expectations. When we don't get what we want, or our expectations aren't met, we become unhappy. How do we overcome this? Buddha suggested that we follow the Eightfold Path. You can't walk down a path blindfolded. You have to know where you want to go and why you are going there. This is known as wisdom. And so, the first 2 aspects of the Eightfold Path are known as right view and right intention. To keep you from getting in trouble on the path, you need to know the rules of the road. Using a similar analogy in the Buddhist view, this would be known as ethical conduct. These guidelines are known as right speech, right action, and right livelihood. If you follow these guidelines, you are less likely to run into the problems that might cause unhappiness or disharmony. And finally, you need to develop and maintain your skills so you can navigate the path more easily. In the Buddhist view, this would be known as concentration. It involves right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. In Buddhism, the Eightfold Path is often symbolized by the Dharma wheel. Think of it as the wheel to help steer you down the right path. To avoid cravings, desire, and the things that will make you unhappy. And there you have it, the road to happiness, the Eightfold Path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. To learn more about the Eightfold Path, subscribe to Buddha Bits.
So, once again, it was helpful to break down the Four Noble Truths and especially the Eightfold Path into categories. Let's take a look now at Buddhists and meditation. Before progressing to compassion with Shantideva and Schopenhauer, we should make a cursory examination of Buddhists and meditation as a part of the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha's prescription for the cessation of suffering. In one of the suttas, Buddha recommended that his disciple Ananda should meditate as a key Buddhist practice. So why do Buddhists meditate? It is the answer to advancing the four divine states of mind. That is, 1, compassion, 2, joy, 3, loving kindness, 4, mental self-control. To see how things really are, unbound from desire and attachment, and accepting that all things are impermanent and do not in themselves satisfy. Meditation aims to reveal the interconnectedness of all things, also known as quieting the monkey mind. A popular 21st century consideration defines meditation as mindfulness, the latter having become a ubiquitous term across the boundaries of popular and serious culture, and one of the most pervasive influences of Buddhism in contemporary British culture. It is a meditation practice acted out in secular contexts, often described as knowingly focusing attention on the present moment and accepting, without judgment, arising thoughts, feelings and sensations. So, mindfulness, why? Supposedly the emotional benefits increase an individual's level of reported happiness and decrease anxiety levels, whereas the physical benefits provide a supportive effect in managing physical pain caused by other health conditions. Consequently, does mindfulness promote Buddhism? Well, this meditation can be done while holding another or no faith. So this is not about conversion. The secular use of mindfulness falls short of Buddhist practice, which aims to develop a broader range of positive mental qualities, especially compassion and ethical living. Mindfulness, it seems, promotes compassion because being mindful is about developing attention, not being lost in thoughtless actions. Now, let us now look at two of the philosophers that offer different accounts of the relationship between compassion and wisdom, of the goals of the enlightened person, and of the experience of compassion. Therefore, this tests your ability to draw together perspectives from religious studies and philosophy. Shantideva was a monk who studied and taught at Nalanda, a university in northern India, in the 8th century. He was teaching within the canon of Mahayana Buddhism, and many of the writings and traditions of the Mahayana ideals of enlightenment have been attributed to Shantideva. His writing and teaching were not just an exploration of ideas, but a form of spiritual instruction within the Buddhist tradition. Now, Schopenhauer belongs to the canon of Western philosophy, part of a conversation that includes Plato, Aristotle, Hume, and Kant. Schopenhauer saw himself reflecting the tradition of Mahayana Buddhism in his own work. He drew parallels between his own thinking and that of Buddhist tradition. In this way, his work crossed traditional borders or boundaries between disciplines, that of philosophy and religious thinking. His work draws ties across time and space in philosophical thinking. It seems that despite cultural differences and philosophical objection, both Schopenhauer and Shantideva concluded that suffering and compassion are necessary parts of life. You may, of course, take a different stance here. Just make sure any position you take is well supported with verifiable evidence and assertive argument. Let's use another video to aid clarity. Robert Thurman talks about the compassion of Shantideva.
Shantideva. We talk about him.
Yeah, Shantideva, well, he was really very far out. And he takes you to the point in patience where when someone harms you, you actually feel sorry for them. And you don't even feel the slightest wish to react to that, because you're really more into their situation than yours. And then you feel sorry for them because by harming you, who are actually nice and cheerful, they're harming themselves, and they're cooking up a bad situation for themselves. So you even feel guilty that you were near enough to them that they will let them harm you. You actually feel that way. You don't feel the slightest revenge or defensiveness or anything. And this is reached. I mean, it sounds frightening to us even, but a person who's really reached that level of enlightenment where you are both people.
Yeah.
You are the enemy. You are the other person as much as yourself, and there's a lot more of them than yourself. So you're less yourself than you are all the other people.
Wow.
And even they kill you, you don't mind, and then you get reborn even happier. And you're confident, you understand that, because you don't identify with the body of this life and with the mentality of this life. You identify with a deep soul energy that is like luminous and is also one with the other people. But in a way, you don't encourage them, of course, to kill you, because it's very bad for them to kill you. Then they've committed a murder, and it's really horrible. And then you're like they're out of body right around there and seeing them getting worse and worse situations. So you definitely try to avoid having them kill you, even for their sake.
Yeah, but there's the story. I mean, yes, I appreciate the story about someone in a concentration camp looking at the Germans killing all those people, and she felt so bad, this woman, for them, because they have lost their humanity. They
Right.
sunk to such low levels that
Yes.
she had so much compassion
Yes.
for the lack of humanity.
Absolutely. And for a Buddhist, they think that they threw these people in ovens and they have like a long oven in hell waiting for them. The Buddhist definitely feels that. So they are creating their own situation in hell. No God is putting them there. No outside forces, but they are creating that for themselves.
So you're saying their enemies will take care of themselves?
They will. They will harm you. They will harm themselves.
Yeah,
They will.
Yeah. You don't have to become an agent of revenge. In other words, you don't have to dedicate your life to getting that person.
Because someone's going to get them eventually.
Their life will unfold. You know that it's like that.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Remember that?
Vengeance is mine,
saith the Lord.
saith the Lord.
So we don't have to do it ourselves.
Right, but going back to the point of Shantideva,
Shantideva,
there is
right.
no enemy. If there's you, only you.
Ultimately, there's no enemy to you, but even if you reach that point of enlightenment where there can't be an enemy to you, you see people being enemy to themselves. So then you still want to help them not be an enemy to themselves. So then you're aware that they think there's an enemy, and then you try to help them. So you write books called Love Your Enemies.
Love your enemy. That's what we're doing here.
That's what you do. That's what Jesus did, what Buddha did, and we're just following in their footsteps.
Okay. In 3 minutes, Thurman elucidates on compassion and Shantideva. Quite remarkable. Bear in mind that it is a purpose of intelligence to explain complex matters in a straightforward, comprehensible manner, not to make the subject more complex. Convey that in your essays. Given that much of Thurman's conversation implicitly refers to the effects of karma, it is incumbent to analyse our understanding of karma. So just take a look at this one.
The relevance of trying to understand karma today is that we need to examine our behavior. When are we compulsively acting in certain ways, whether constructive or destructive, whether as a perfectionist or somebody who is just, very negative and criticizing others all the time, so that we can develop the discrimination of what are the effects of our behavior, what are the effects on others, what are the effects on ourselves. We discriminate between when it's going to be harmful and when it's going to be beneficial, because if you look at the teachings on karma, what it describes is that first the feeling comes up to say something or to do something, and it's only after that feeling comes up that then we compulsively act on it. So there's a space between these two, and through meditation, which we develop, we slow things down and become more introspective, we're able to recognize that space and use that space between when we feel like saying or doing something, when we actually do something, when we implement it, to decide, is this helpful, is this harmful? And if it's going to be harmful, then, as the great Indian master Shantideva says, just act like a rock, like a lump of wood. Don't do it. And it's not a matter of repression and suppressing, oh, I want to do it, and so on. It's not like that. It's not that we're a policeman with ourselves, but rather that we use our intelligence. This is our greatest gift as human beings. We have the intelligence. We can discriminate between what's helpful and what's harmful. And so we need to cultivate that. And this is, what Buddhism teaches us very, very much.
Schopenhauer, in contrast, was a European philosopher writing and teaching in the early to mid-19th century. His writings were independent from the study of Buddhism. However, comparisons can be drawn, and there is certainly an overlap in thinking, philosophy and beliefs. Indeed, Schopenhauer was interested in the Eastern religions of Hinduism and Buddhism throughout his life. Now, there are several points of comparison that might be drawn between Schopenhauer's and Shantideva's views. Both regard compassion as a painful response to suffering. Both emphasize its role in motivating altruistic behavior. Both relate it to no self and the wisdom needed to escape from suffering. So before moving further with Schopenhauer, it is appropriate to look at the notion of pessimism. Watch this short video.
This is going to be a very bad film. It will teach you nothing. You'll wonder at the end where those few minutes of your life have gone. You will feel bitter, resentful, and increasingly furious. Now that's a tiny example of what pessimism can do for you. It prepares you for the worst, reduces the tension of expectations, protects you from disappointment, and might even make you laugh a bit. It should be a recipe for life. We live in an absurdly and painfully optimistic world. Mostly, that's the result of all the businesses out there trying to sell us things, and, understandably, using cheerfulness to do it. And partly, it's the influence of technology, which is always getting better, colouring our view of life as a whole, which often isn't improving. In the process, we've lost sight of the wisdom of seeing the glass half empty. For centuries, religions peddled dark messages. Buddhism told its followers that life was suffering. Christianity spoke of the fallen state of mankind and of the inevitability of earthly imperfection. That was helpful. It kept our expectations in check. The psychologist William James came up with an equation. Happiness equals expectations over reality. So there are two ways to ensure contentment: change reality or change expectations. Pessimists know to reduce the expectations. Good pessimists rehearse some key lessons to themselves every day. life generally goes wrong. Everyone is worried and sad most of the time. It's normal to have very big regrets around careers. The only people we can think of as normal are people we don't yet know very well. It's hard to be happy for more than 15 minutes. Almost all your hopes are going to be dashed. Mediocrity is the norm. Today, however grim, will probably be one of those days you end up looking back on and wondering why you didn't appreciate more fully. That's how much worse it will eventually get. Don't think of us pessimists as grim. The gap between what should be and what is can be filled with laughter. A generous laughter born of certainty that today will go wrong, tomorrow will probably be even worse, until the worst of all happens. But that's okay.
Well, the value of that perspective is it modifies our view of pessimism and makes us appreciate that there may be different ways of looking at any treasured concept. They are not axiomatic, not a tradition. Despite Schopenhauer declaring that his writing was too late to have been directly influenced by the teachings of Buddhism, he himself saw parallels between his writing and Buddhism's teaching. His most celebrated work, The World as Will and Representation, includes a discussion that of all religions, it is Buddhism that comes closest to his own views. Therefore, there are parallels to be made, similarities and differences which cross the boundaries of culture, space, and time. However, the two philosophers offer different accounts of the relationship between compassion and wisdom, of the goals of the enlightened person, and of the experience of compassion. So what is compassion in Buddhism?
What is compassion is to have the strong wish, the strong motivation that others be free from suffering and that which causes them suffering. In other words, that one looks into the lives of others. One is sufficiently able to step outside one's own so-called urgent needs and step out of beyond those walls of self-interest and look into another's life or look into others' lives. And when we do, honestly, then we see there's so many ways in which people are caught up in suffering, whether it be emotional suffering, whether it be the physical sufferings of old age, of sickness, of death and so on. In a way, the whole world is just full of suffering. Every nook and cranny has its tears. So we feel that, but so it's a big kind of radical step to open our eyes and our heart to that. And when we do, it's inevitable that the thought will arise in us, the feeling arises, may they be free from suffering. May they come to be free from everything that troubles them, that locks them into suffering. And in thinking that, then we also ask ourselves the question, and what is it that brings about suffering for others? What is it that locks them into these difficulties, into this misery? And the answer is, finally, actually it's their mistaken way. Just like my suffering is caused by my mistaken perception of the world and all the negative emotions, desire, hatred, and so on that flow from that, so ultimately the source of most of the suffering that afflicts others is in a way lying in their own actions. So one must not just wish them to be free from the immediate experience of suffering, but to come to live in such a way that ensures this, they won't lock themselves further into suffering. In other words, may they be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. And the cause of suffering, I say, are the disturbing emotions, desire, hatred, and pride and jealousy, which lock people so firmly into negative ways of acting, which produce not happiness as they hope, but just suffering, because they're beating their head against the wall of reality, just as I've been doing. So compassion is that. It is not merely a sentiment or a fleeting emotion. it has a kind of wisdom and an intelligence. It looks accurately into what is a suffering experienced by beings, and then asks what is the cause. So there must always be a measure of intelligence and wisdom accompanying compassion. And that ensures it is not merely a sentimental response that one feels good about having. In compassion, there's no stress on I, there is stress only on others.
Schopenhauer and Shantideva's beliefs regarding suffering are vital to understanding their respective views on compassion. Schopenhauer believed that compassion must be achieved first to understand and eventually eliminate suffering. However, Shantideva, like many Buddhists of the Mahayana tradition, believed both are dependent on each other. The Mahayana tradition being just one of many, Shantideva worked within this tradition, and his work was influential within this canon of religious thought. Over time, Mahayana masters would teach their own individual versions of the path to enlightenment to expedite progress on the Buddhist path, to adjust the teaching to be better understood in a particular time and place, or even for a specific individual. This makes the understanding of this strand of Buddhism difficult to grasp in any definite way, but a guiding principle is that direct insight and understanding of the Buddha's teaching must be closely connected to compassion. This is where compassion therefore sits within the Noble Eightfold Path. The path to enlightenment for a Mahayana Buddhist or an enlightened one, a Bodhisattva, involves not only striving for one's own enlightenment, but also committing to being reincarnated to bring enlightenment to all things. The path of enlightenment for a Bodhisattva is achieved through recognition of the interdependence of all things and an experience of compassion for all living things. The key concept of no self must be considered when comparing Schopenhauer with Shantideva. Buddhism teaches that everything is constantly changing, nothing stays the same. Nature is constantly changing from birth, growth, dying to decay. All living things are in a state of transition, or a transient state. The same applies to the self. Our world is constantly transforming around us. It makes sense that our inner self should be just as impermanent as our surroundings. There is no self, no definite you. So, what does Schopenhauer have to say concerning the path to happiness?
When we hear the name Arthur Schopenhauer, descriptors such as pessimistic, misanthropic, and melancholic come to mind. But in this video, we will set these aside to focus on Schopenhauer's path to happiness. What does his philosophy have to offer us in respect to something so seemingly antithetical to his own worldview? To better understand, I think it would be best to first expose ourselves to his path to suffering. Schopenhauer believed, like those profound philosophies of the East, that suffering has its roots embedded in desire. That desire is like the alms thrown to a beggar, that keeps him alive today in order that his misery may be prolonged tomorrow. No matter the number of desires fulfilled, there will always be innumerable others ready and willing to occupy any vacancy that happens to open up. Where Schopenhauer departs from his Eastern influencers is that he sees no solution in the complete abolishment of desire, because as soon as want and suffering permit rest to a man, ennui is at once so near that he necessarily requires diversion. Ennui being a feeling of listlessness and dissatisfaction arising from lack of occupation or excitement. We are doomed with desire, and we are doomed without it. We are like hedgehogs, clustering together for warmth, uncomfortable when too closely packed, and yet miserable when kept apart. The disconsolate nature of this situation leads most to seek riches as the final solution. Should we then seek riches? No. While riches are, as said by Schopenhauer, absolutely good, They alone can achieve nothing, because our happiness depends on what we have in our heads rather than on what we have in our pockets. To be happy in this worst of all possible worlds, we must at once recede into ourselves and focus all of our power on strengthening our intellect and refining the constitution of our consciousness. Throughout his masterpiece, The World as Will and Idea, Schopenhauer explains what is required of us to achieve this mastery over our will. We should begin with the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom. This should be sought above all else. Second, it would be of our benefit to adopt a determinist philosophy which recognizes everything as the inevitable result of its antecedents. The reason for this indefatigable pursuit of knowledge being the more knowledge we obtain, the better we can examine ourselves. And the better we can examine ourselves, the better we can understand the passions that would eventually lead us down the path of suffering if gone unchecked. While going about this self-examination, we should strive to observe everything we uncover with pure objectivity, leaving out any personal interest that may attempt to lead us down the fruitless path of desire. If the task at hand seems daunting, Schopenhauer suggests that we look to those great minds of the past for guidance, since it is only for such loving minds that these great ones have lived. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe for more on Eastern and Western philosophy. And as always, thank you for talking philosophy with me. Until next time.
You can therefore gather that Schopenhauer attempts to appeal to a diverse audience, whereas Shantideva, simply put, makes his philosophical statements and imparts them generally with no fixed audience. This probably explains why we must give more space here to Schopenhauer than Shantideva. Schopenhauer also believes this to be true, but with different ethical conclusions. The preoccupation with our own needs and desires causes us to strive for our own wants to the detriment of all. This is the opposite of compassion in terms of Mayahana Buddhism, where the path of enlightenment is dependent on the striving for not only one's enlightenment, but the compassion to strive for the enlightenment of all other living beings. Comparison between Shantideva's Mayahana tradition within Buddhism and Schopenhauer's theories and philosophies must refer to shared cornerstones of both traditions. Schopenhauer believed that true morality had its roots in compassion for others. This reflects on the renunciation of the belief of no self, shared by both Schopenhauer and Shantideva. Schopenhauer believed that acting morally means acting altruistically, but both emphasize its role in motivating altruistic behavior. Touching upon Buddhism's universality of all suffering, Schopenhauer proposed that compassion must necessarily involve suffering with others in a truly altruistic way. This looking outwards from us with overriding compassion for others enables some people to appreciate the universality of suffering. Shantideva states, "Nirvana is the object of my striving." Schopenhauer explains his belief that salvation from suffering can be achieved through altruism and moral virtue. However, there are difficulties with Schopenhauer's ideas about the importance of compassion to living a moral life. He states that to live morally, we must be compassionate, primarily to others, therefore burdening ourselves with an altruism for all humanity. And this is like the conclusions of Robert Thurman's discussion regarding Shantideva. Still, Schopenhauer states that this extensive altruistic view of compassion for others distracts us from our own suffering, but only because it immerses us in the suffering of others. Moreover, that the experience of others' suffering and misfortunes is not as debilitating as the contemplation of our own suffering and misfortunes, but it is not clear why this should be. Somewhat contrary, he states that bearing the suffering of others can be so burdensome as to make it impossible for them to continue along the path to salvation. Both regard compassion as a painful response to suffering. Shantideva's writing about the importance of compassion and the role of compassion plays on the path to enlightenment differs significantly from Schopenhauer's philosophical discussions of compassion. Mahayana Buddhism is notably a practical school, and a bodhisattva is a person who has shunned the notion of self, turned aside from the futile suffering of the world, and is striving for enlightenment, not just for themselves, but for all other living beings. To this end, the bodhisattva seeks to cultivate wisdom and compassion. In Shantideva's Way of the Bodhisattva, he describes the process of self-scrutiny and meditation through which this is achieved, thereby proposing practical ways to achieve this state of wisdom and compassion. Enlightenment for us, and ultimately for all living things, is achieved initially through meditation. Schopenhauer does not take his thinking into the practical realm. His ideology is rational thought. Shantideva talks of the interdependence of beings, but also in his writing, compassion does not come before all else. It is not a prerequisite for the journey to salvation. Within the Mahayana canon, compassion and wisdom walk together. They need to be cultivated together, and each supports the other. Shantideva also talks of the bodhisattva's reward being not just the escape from suffering for themselves, but the aim of the bodhisattva is to put an end to all suffering. This follows the thinking that there is no self. If there is no self, there can be no selfishness. All must be altruism. The key difference here is that the bodhisattva is actively engaged in the world and has a vulnerability to the pain of compassion. This contrasts with Schopenhauer's notion that to follow an altruistic path in compassion is to detract from the suffering of ourselves. Arguably, Shantideva's vision of all suffering is more inclusive, but both related to no self and the wisdom needed to escape from suffering. Furthermore, Shantideva and Schopenhauer also differ in their views of what compassion is like as an experience. Schopenhauer's view of compassion and compassion for others and the suffering that ensues is all-encompassing. Although, as has been explored, this point has some contradiction. Schopenhauer is a pessimist in this way. He sees the ultimate place being a place of willlessness, a state of losing the will to live. Let's draw towards a close on an enlightening talk concerning pessimism and how its orthodox negative connotation is perhaps just a matter of perception and needs fresh imagining.
Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to now jump approximately 1200 years from the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages to the height of the modern era, from around the 600s AD to the mid-1800s AD. A huge jump. Why are we doing this? Well, partially because we're introducing you to the broad strokes of a conversation that went on for thousands of years, and what we're only doing is looking at the highlights. But also because it is at this time that we have a major shift, and it is this major shift that's going to help you understand how we got to the present era and to the general thinking that you imbibe every day unconsciously. So what was the major shift from the Middle Ages to the modern era? I want to say that is a shift from optimism to pessimism. Now you've heard the old saying of what distinguishes an optimist from a pessimist, right? The optimist says the glass is half full, and the pessimist says the glass is half empty. Well, that's not quite right, is it? Really, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to empty the glass, then the optimist will say that the glass is half empty. And if you're trying to fill the glass, then the optimist will say the glass is half full, and vice versa. So what does this tell us about optimism versus pessimism? It tells us that a good view of life, or a view that says that life in general is good versus a view that says life in general sucks, depends on one crucial concept. What's the goal in life? But true pessimism only comes when you think life is pointless. When any kind of goal that is set is arbitrary and unachievable. And we can say that this is the major shift. Now, if you notice, in the Middle Ages, I characterize life as a happy face. But the main point of the happy face is the smile, isn't it? That's what distinguishes the happy face from the frowny face, the optimist from the pessimist. See, the optimist doesn't say that there aren't low points in life, that life doesn't get low. The idea is what happens at the end, right? At the end, it all picks up. It all ends on a high point. And that's true optimism. And we see that Boethius characterizes the Middle Ages because even though this was an era that agreed that there was a tremendous amount of suffering, no other era in the history of the West is more full of suffering than the Middle Ages, with wars and plagues and short life without any medication or medicine. Most people lived short and brief and miserable, tough lives. But yet, they were optimists. Why? Because they believed the basic picture of Boethius. And that is that even though life is full of striving, there's an ultimate purpose behind all of it. And this ultimate purpose is achievable if one believes. Now, the key here is that this is what reason tells us. It's not something that faith just arbitrarily gives us. Boethius summarizes and gives us the rational explanations as to why we can have an optimistic view and not leave our brain at the door of the church. So what's the major shift? The major shift is when the rational person no longer can believe this. What we're going to see in the shift to the modern age and the rise of science is a shift from believing that life in general has a point to believing that it's pointless, or that any point that it has is arbitrary, what you give it, and therefore as worthless as you are. And so both views agree that life is full of striving towards something. Everybody's striving for a purpose. Life is striving. But the difference is without a purpose, it's pointless. There is no ultimate purpose to life. So what's the crucial difference? The crucial difference is the belief in a creator, God. If there is a creator, then life has a purpose. Even if there's suffering, in the end, it all works out because God is good, and God takes that suffering and works toward a greater good, as we saw in Boethius. But if we can prove that the belief in God is irrational and baseless, then what happens is we have the striving towards something, but no hope of success. No hope that even if we are successful, that what we've achieved is anything better than being able to pick your nose for a long time. And so what we see is the frowny face. Again, the frowny face doesn't deny that there are high points in life. Indeed, the key to the tragedy of life is that there are high points. The higher you go, the farther you fall at the end. Because in the end, there's no ultimate purpose. You seem for a while to do well, but in the end, you die. It all comes crashing down. So, what I'm going to argue is that the major shift is from optimism to pessimism. And the key difference is that everyone agrees that there is striving toward purpose in human life. The difference is whether there is an ultimate purpose, whether there is a point to this striving. what we're going to see when we study people like Schopenhauer and then the Buddha, who greatly influenced Schopenhauer, is the main point of life is that it's pointless. And therefore, that life is suffering, but suffering that's not worth it. The key, though, will be whether we can believe in a creator or not. And so the first lecture that we're going to look at is Schopenhauer's argument that there can be no God. In fact, that the arguments that there are a God, that there is a God, are bad, and that we can literally prove that there can be no such being. And all of this will depend on a shift from one theory of how we gain knowledge to another theory.
Shantideva has an optimistic purpose. He expounds on the joy that comes as a reward to relieving the suffering of others. In verse 108 of The Way of the Bodhisattva, he described this as an ocean-like immensity of joy. In this way, Shantideva offers hope that compassion is worth the pain. Individual suffering is renounced. Suffering is just broadly suffering. There is no self and therefore no individual burden. Schopenhauer's compassion does not motivate us to action, as Shantideva's does. Schopenhauer stops short of considering how this affects our experience of compassion. Compassion is the ability to be empathetic and to really understand in your heart what the person in front of you is doing. So, thank you very much, and I hope you got what you needed from that. Bye-bye.